Hey there, welcome to Local Legends. I hope you're doing well. Today, we're going to be finding our sea legs and diving headfirst into Southend's history. I hope you're ready to walk the plank. The local legend we're talking about today could quite possibly be Southend's biggest claim to fame, and it sprawls out all the way into the distance behind me. In fact, it's the longest pleasure pier in the world. Southend Pier even has its own railway to the end, but the tickets are cheaper if you walk, so that's what I'll be doing. Nothing wrong with a good walk, is there? Now, it's over a mile to the end of the pier, so we're going to take some pit stops along the way to take a deeper dive into the history of the pier, which is almost as extensive as the pier itself. Today's legend brings us all the way back to the early 19th century. Seaside resorts were popping up left, right and centre, as well-to-do Victorians rushed out of the smog and soot of the cities to the apparent healing properties of the salty sea air. Sunny Southend was one of these up-and-coming resort towns. However, the sea itself, which Southend is on, was stunting its growth. Being on the estuary of the River Thames, where river meets sea, the water levels are highly influenced by the tides. The English Channel moves in and out of the estuary twice a day, meaning the water level rises and falls dramatically. This causes an issue for boats that want to dock at this growing town. So this posed a bit of an issue at the time when railway transport was just being invented. Boats were the most popular ways for tourists to get to towns like Southend. So what did they do about it? As you were probably expecting after clicking on this video, they decided to build a pier. Campaigning to the government was spearheaded by one Sir William Haygate, a resident of Southend, who served as the mayor of the City of London for a year. His contribution to the conception of the pier itself is celebrated to this day, as one of the locomotives, which runs on the pier's very own railway, was given his name and recognition. Once the Southend Pier Act of 1829 was passed, it only took just over a year for the project to be completed, and Southend Pier was born. The first incarnation of the pier stood over 180 metres long. Now, that might sound tiny compared to its current length today, but in actuality, that's the same length as the Gherkin skyscraper from ground floor to tip. Unlike the Gherkin, however, this pier was made of wood and only wood. However, it wouldn't be long before the pier was completely torn apart and rebuilt again, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. If you're enjoying the video so far and would like to see more local legends, it would mean the world if you subscribed and gave this video a like. Tourism boomed in the years following the pier's construction, along with the opening of the railways from London in the 1850s. This increased foot traffic was taking its toll on the wooden structure of the pier, and the decision was made in 1887 to rebuild the pier with a strong, durable iron base. Costing the equivalent of nearly £10 million in today's money, the new pier was the brainchild of James Brunlees. Known as the designer of Southport Pier, he built Southend Pier to withstand its ever-increasing demand. And build it he did. The new incarnation of the pier, which was opened in 1889, stood at roughly 1.3 miles long. If we're still going with the Gherkin analogy, that's 12 of those skyscrapers stacked on top of each other. And that's pretty much as long as the pier is today. As visitor numbers increased year on year, and the pier actually served its intended purpose, things seemed to be on the up and up for Southend and its pier. That was until war descended on Europe. A great war, they called it. What it wasn't great for, though, was tourism in the southeast of England. While air raids weren't nearly as common as what would come later, don't worry, we'll get to it, Southend Pier did find itself being useful in this conflict. During the war, they had a number of prison ships moored at the end of the pier. Then they had German prisoners of war walked along the entire length of the high street and then along the entire length of the pier. That's gotta be a war crime, right? The interwar period was a bit of a liminal time for the pier, if you look back on it from today's perspective. They didn't know a Second World War would be coming, so after the Great War, everything went back to status quo. The equivalent of nearly £4.5 million was spent on the pier, which resulted in an extension that brought the pier to its record-breaking length that it still holds to this day. The only other notable event which occurred in the interwar period was the celebration of the pier's 100th anniversary, which happened 5 years after its actual anniversary because it reflects the date in which the Admiralty began to include Southend Pier on their navigational charts. Yep, I've got no clue either. But it doesn't matter, as it wasn't the most noteworthy thing to happen in the 1930s. I'm of course talking about war. And by war, I mean the Second World War, of course. Why do I sound so enthusiastic, you might ask? Well, it's totally got nothing to do with my previous World War II video performing significantly better than any of my other videos. Oh, and by the way, I don't think I've mentioned it yet, you should totally like and subscribe. Discarding my selfish ambitions, the Second World War was possibly the most important time historically for Southend Pier. Right as the war was kicking off, the Royal Navy commandeered and completely transformed the pier. Going by the new name of HMS Lee, the pier served two main functions throughout the war. Firstly, as a mustering point for convoys of ships heading out through the Thames, with over 84,000 ships passing by between 1939 and 1945. Its second purpose was as a command centre for the entire Thames estuary, where it also acted as a powerful line of defence against German aircraft, due to its unique positioning so far out to sea. The only major casualty from the Thames in the Second World War was that of the SS Richard Montgomery, which you may remember I briefly mentioned in a previous video, which I'd highly recommend watching if you find World War II history of interest. Now that you've watched that, we can move on to the tumultuous century that the pier has had since the end of the Second World War, with some unfortunately referring to it as the era of the pier's decline. The package holiday boom of the 1960s had a substantial impact on seaside communities up and down the country. Tourists diverting to Ibiza and Marbella meant less jobs, opportunities and income for people who live in towns like Southend and Margate. However, this wasn't the only trial the pier had to overcome in the last century. The word fire is written over 40 times on Southend Pier's Wikipedia page, with 5 notable fire-related incidents taking place since the late 1950s. These unfortunate events, along with a lack of funding and interest, nearly led the pier to close in the 1980s. The pier is particularly susceptible to fires due to its Victorian wooden decking and distance from the shore to pierhead. Another noted reason is due to a lack of water supply. Yep, I don't get why either. Even after all of this, the pier has remained open and accessible to the public. With new investments in electric trains and making the end of the pier a more worthwhile destination, it looks like Southend Pier may just stand the test of time. So that's the history of Southend Pier. It's kind of crazy how many stories can come from what is essentially a wooden bridge connecting lands to nothing. Anyway, it's a 1.25 mile walk back to the shore, so I should probably start the trek about now. Ta-ra!